For more on this story, we can bring in our international affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert. Doug, people saw this military takeover coming for months, and here it is.
Absolutely. And look, let's not mince words about it. This is a classic coup. This is a textbook coup, right? The classic, the military leaders sitting there, in all the
military
uniforms.
Fatigue,
yeah. And basically saying, and insisting they're doing this on behalf of the people, that they are the only people, they are the only institution that can guarantee the security, the safety, the well-being, the welfare of the nation, and that the others, the civilian leaders, just can't. We saw something very similar to it, obviously not exactly identical, in Egypt in 2013, where military leaders seized power, claiming to be doing it in the interest of the people. The irony, the bitter irony perhaps, is that they often do end up garnering quite a bit of the support from the population itself. So the civilian support that they claim, there are civilians who do support them, and that's part of what we saw coming. We have had demonstrations and counter-demonstrations in recent weeks in front of the presidential palace in Khartoum, the capital. We've had pro-military sit-ins, that is, sit-ins by protesters who support the military, wanted to see them taking over from the civilians, because remember, since the ouster of Bashar, of the dictator, the 30-year dictator, Omar Bashir, in 2019, you've had this hybrid military/civilian council, sovereignty council ruling Sudan, which has been on track, transitioning, a very fragile transition, to democracy. Elections were supposed to be held very shortly, and they were supposed to hand off on November 17th, had been the deadline set by the now ousted prime minister for an actual full handover to civilian rule. So we've had military sit-ins. We had a thwarted coup attempt actually last month, thwarted by people sympathetic to that ousted dictator, Bashir, who's still in Sudan, people sympathetic to him basically demanding the overthrow of the civilian part of this government, saying that it had totally failed in its mission. We had an assassination attempt recently against the prime minister himself. We've had demonstrations, counter-demonstrations, tens of thousands of demonstrators just the past weekend in favor of civilian democratic transition in the streets of Khartoum. It's been extremely tense, but what we've had are all of the dominoes lined up for exactly this type of scenario.
In recent months, Sudan has been making efforts to end decades of international isolation and improve foreign ties. How will this now jeopardize those efforts that have been made?
Well, maybe all bets are off. I mean, look, you're absolutely right. They have been trying to open up. There have been, decades of isolation of Sudan. Remember that the former dictator, Omar Bashir, the ousted one, he hosted, terrorists. He hosted at one point Osama bin Laden in Sudan. This was a man who was, also waged endless wars, including the notorious war in Darfur, in the western region of Sudan, which killed tens of thousands, displaced, over 1 million. That war has subsided a bit, but there have been a whole series of civil conflicts and other wars in Sudan, which continue at varying levels of intensity to rage. A lot of this a legacy of Omar Bashir, who was very much a man intent on his own personal enrichment, enriching his own clan, and he really, according to almost everyone out there who watches democratic governance in Africa, agreed that this was a man who did not do too much for the betterment of Sudan as a whole. Alas, we had the splitting of Sudan and South Sudan's independence in 2011. There has been an effort by these new leaders, the now ousted civilian government, to reach out to the West. The U.S. notably took Sudan off its terrorist list last year. It's also had hundreds of millions of dollars in humanitarian assistance to the country, which perhaps now are in jeopardy. And all of this could be on the brink right now, because we don't know whether or not these military leaders, it's even in their interest to continue this outrage.
And very briefly, the International Criminal Court at The Hague has been pressing Sudan to hand over the country's former dictator, Omar al-Bashir, you've been mentioning. What are the prospects that can happen now?
Small. Why should they hand him over? You're absolutely right, that the transitional civilian government had started to make overtures about handing him over. Like I said, Omar al-Bashir remains in Sudan, but there have been demands by the International Criminal Tribunal at The Hague for him to be handed over to face justice for war crimes in an international tribunal. And that has been a big stake in Sudan's, transitioning democracy. Will or will that not happen? You could argue that a lot of these generals, one of the generals who is now apparently in this coup cabal, if you will, was one of the leaders. He led one of the worst groups in Darfur, accused of some of the absolute worst abuses in that region. These are generals who in many cases cases, have a lot to hide, have a record that they're not going to want to flaunt before the rest of the world. And one thing that they're probably not going to want is a former dictator to whom many had relatively close ties appearing before an international tribunal outside Sudan itself, able to testify potentially against them and reveal wrongdoing and perhaps even worse on their behalf. It is not in the general's interest. Doesn't mean it can't happen, won't happen. No, but it's not in their interest to hand over Omar Bashir. So don't look for that to happen anytime soon. And don't look for that democratic transition, which we saw the very beginnings of, to have a very easy going after this.
Doug, thank you very much for that. Douglas Herbert there.